Okay, welcome back to our last installment. Let me go through our roll for the very last time. Last roll. Such every little thing. It's the last time. Exam. I'll talk about the exam after our brief summing up lecture here. But just to let you know, it is the 9th. There's Monday, 2 to 4. All right, Benjamin.
Wait, is it the same classroom?
Yes, same classroom. Benjamin's here. Chase, Blake,
Here.
Brock, Linda,
Here.
Brandon.
Here.
And Linda, did you get in touch with Patricia? Okay. Brandon's here. Jonathan, Lexi,
Yes.
Miley, Jacob, Jordan,
Here.
James, Dee,
Here.
Bianca, Jacob.
Oh, that was me the second.
Oh, Jacob Frank. Oh, yeah, you're both here. Antonia, Lucian, Everardo, Ella, Alicia, Casey.
Here.
Is she coming?
I think she is, yes.
That was not authentic. You're not being yourself. But she will come. Okay, we'll see.
She's going to be here.
Riley, Isaac, Paula.
Chris.
There it is. Robert, Abdullah, and Lake.
Here.
Isaiah, Logan, and Madeline. All right, very good. So, today I just want to wrap up a couple more things to say about Kierkegaard, and then tie in. Oh, she vouched for you. If you didn't show, you both would have been absent. Wrap up where we were, just a few things from Kierkegaard, then jump to Foucault. Really just to sum up the semester, I'm not going to go into much depth. I wanted to just focus on a couple of points that Foucault raises, and then I'm going to break you into small groups to work on your, just review a collaborative effort to get a different set of eyes and minds on your paper. Preferably, hopefully somebody who might have disagreement, find a disagreement, thereby helping you come up with a potential rebuttal. So, let's see. Where do we leave off? We were confused with Kierkegaard's, we call him that, Kierkegaard's description of Abraham. He leaves us with a concern. He leaves us with, I think confusion is the right word. I think he's doing that on purpose, and he's doing that mostly with an audience in mind who are Christians. He's responding to Christendom. He's responding to complacency, what he feels is complacency. What he feels is people becoming content, smug in their faith. If you look at the history of religion and religious studies and religious teachings, Kierkegaard says they focus mostly on, in this case, Isaac being returned. Isaac being returned to Abraham, and not the doubt, not the confusion, not the anxiety, not the dread, not the reality that surely someone who is confronted with what they, let's say, know is God. There's doubt with Abraham, of course. The doubt is whether or not he'll get Abraham back, whether or not he'll get Isaac back. But at the same time, he has faith that he will. There's not doubt that he's talking to God. I don't think that's doubtful. And much more needs to be said on that. Thankfully, there's almost a whole semester's worth of material on that next time, looking at religious. There it is, the religious experience, and that gets discussed. But much of what Kierkegaard's doing is trying to unsettle people in their complacency. And in this way, he's very much like Socrates. And very much like Foucault, as it turns out. Foucault, if you know anything about him, he was one for unsettling our presumptions about history in particular, but about all sorts of other sociological, psychological elements that we take for granted. At the very least, we can take from Kierkegaard that he's concerned with us just taking things for granted. And one of the things that he's concerned with is that we can just use our powers of reason and logic and philosophy and then come to meaning, come to purpose, find a reason for existing. Even Camus was aware of this. Remember the quote from Camus about the ontological argument? What was it?
No one ever died beyond the
I assume that that's accurate. I mean, that quote is accurate. I assume that that's a true statement. Who would die for that? People die for beliefs. They don't die for arguments. Now, that's good, right? Russell would say the same, right? I would never kill for a belief because I might be mistaken. Russell and Kierkegaard are very different in that regard. But might not the existentialist respond, well, what have I? Nobody lives for arguments either. If I'm not going to die for it, perhaps I won't live for it either. And so this conception of meaning, we're back to Simon Critchley. We might have all of the relevant scientific, logical facts. The question of meaning doesn't go away. We haven't answered it. I'm sorry.
I was researching Kierkegaard yesterday, and Camus' name popped up for the absurdity.
Uh-huh.
And what it said is, Camus' absurdity is basically what Kierkegaard's trying to argue, is what Kierkegaard's argument turns into absurdity.
Say that again?
Because Camus talks about accepting your fate as is, and Kierkegaard says you have to look outwards. And what it said is that Camus would consider that absurdity, just following into the absurdity.
Oh, yes. So they are. I'm not sure if I follow it, but they're diametrically opposed conceptions of what to do with absurdity. For Camus, it's a recognition. In both of them, it's a consciousness. It's a recognition. In fact, they both use, as does Dostoevsky, a kind of lucidity, conscious lucidity, awareness. For Camus, it's recognizing that our reason's never going to be sated. We're not going to get an answer to the question of meaning and purpose and function and so forth. And yet, stick with it without appeal, which is to say, without leaping, which is the opposite of what Kierkegaard suggests. Camus thinks that we can do it alone because we have no other choice. Kierkegaard says you can't do it alone, right? There's, what was that? Somebody walked past with balloons. You're not able to do it alone, and in fact, one of the reasons you need to, what Kierkegaard will say is, use the absurd to push you into this realm of faith. Because nothing else works. Argument, logic is, to beat a dead horse here, the wrong tool. And I think this analogy gets it fairly well as far as what Kierkegaard seems to be saying. The person who presents a rational argument for God's existence is like someone who comes upon a man dying of thirst and gives him a lecture on the chemical properties of water. That's from Kierkegaard. Now, clearly it would be a dumb thing to do, a terrible thing to do, an unethical thing to do, a foolish thing to do this. Why is this analogy apt? Or is it? Maybe you disagree. Yeah.
I feel like dying of thirst is something you can prove. You can't really say that believing or not believing in God is as matter as.
It is for Kierkegaard, but that's a good point. So your response to that is to say that clearly, we do know people who die of thirst, and it would be foolish for us to give a logical argument. That's a different kind of absurdity. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the state, dying of thirst, is like a state of being, and he's using it analogously to needing like a religious following. So it's like if I'm dying or if I need a religious following, a description of religion isn't going to satisfy that thirst. It can only be contained or realized through pure faith and experience of believing in God.
Which itself, to go back to Abraham, can't be done and achieved through reason or logic or philosophy. Those are even philosophy, as he thinks these are the wrong terms, these are the wrong tools. To put it a different way, ways that we've looked at it before, the logical thinking, in fact, pushes God away. Actually, at one point he puts it this way: our reason tells us that the infinite, God is infinite. And reason at the same time says that to know something, to make comparisons, to use analogies, this is oftentimes what theologians will do within Christendom and other faiths as well, is to try to make analogies to talk about the goodness or greatness of God, but always in comparison to humanity. But our reason tells us that there's an infinite, how much of a distance is there between the finite mortal beings like we, such as ourselves, and an infinite God? Of course, there's an infinity. There's an infinite chasm between us and this God. Logic, reason, in fact, will push us away from such a being. It tells us we cannot advance through logic, through argumentation, through abstraction. Although this is easier than it is to exist, as he says. And if you look at what Abraham goes through, I think part of what he's referring to is that we become, within Christendom at the age that he's writing, whether or not it's relevant to us today, we'll come back to. But it's become easier to be a Christian. It's to be faithful without having to think. Without having to confront the kinds of things that Kierkegaard thinks that are essential to existing, do I want to get to this? In a way that's, how do we put it? Well, I'll just put it the way that Kierkegaard himself puts it. He says, mere cognitive assent, objective understanding. This will not do because objectivity demands so little of me. Objectively, I can know things, but without caring about them. In fact, that's what Aristotle says, which is so fascinating about the educated individual, is someone who can entertain beliefs or entertain ideas without believing them. He says further, indeed, the essential feature of objectivity is a lack of passion. Objective truths are not about us. The truths that matter for him are those that are subjective. That's his conception of truth as subjectivity, which is outside of the realm of logic, outside of the realm of reason. And it leads to I wanted to tie in pragmatism at the end here, because we discussed this with pragmatism, did we not? This right to believe, I think, with respect to James. Didn't this movie come up? This is from the, which I have not seen. I think this image is enough. 127 hours. We get this is fun. And we get a sense of this guy being stuck here, and he has no indication logically that he can escape, I don't think. Is that not the case? He's not been stuck like this before. He doesn't have a previous acquaintance with or inductive argument to escape this particular situation. But he chooses to believe that he can escape by, I guess it doesn't show there. What is he holding? A watch?
Knife.
That looks like a watch.
Maybe that's the knife, but he cuts off.
So he does that, but when he's doing it, he's probably saying to himself, you could do this. He has faith that it's going to work. Or is faith the right word? He doesn't have trust. He doesn't have probabilistic reasoning.
I think he doesn't have other options.
Yeah, he doesn't have any options. I guess he could wait another hour, right? This is James's conception. This goes back to the analogy, and it's not perfect, obviously, but for Kierkegaard, without God, one is lost. This is Kierkegaard's strong view. Obviously, this is not going to be the case for the atheist existentialist. But he eventually does this, and here I made the contrast or comparison with pragmatism last time. For James, it is a living and momentous and forced option. You either believe that you can do it, it's a live option in the sense that you can imagine choosing to believe it. It's momentous in that it makes a difference. And it is, what is it? What did I say? Living, momentous, and forced, right? You either choose to try it, to do it, or you just sit there and die. In the way that James sees religion like that, and I think the way that Kierkegaard does too, it's just the leap of faith for Kierkegaard is one that seems to completely go beyond reason in a way that Pragmatism does not. So there's a distinction between these two. Kierkegaard's conception of faith seems to completely avoid and supersede or transcend reason, except for the fact that he chooses Christianity. Why does he choose that? Is there an explanation for that? Does he have a reason for that? Is it a passional choice, or is it a choice made by reason? Where is the Venn diagram, so to speak, of reason and faith, or passion and reflective intellectual endeavors? When does one get to choose based on pure passion, emotion, feeling, subjectivity, and is that choice itself driven by nothing but these passions? One of the things that Kierkegaard's conclusion, that we get from Kierkegaard's conception, and I borrow this from Douglas Socio, I think that's how you say it, Socio, is it seems that Kant would be wrong if Kierkegaard is correct about at least the conception of truth and subjectivity. Then the Enlightenment is also wrong. Universal, generalized humanistic ethics are inadequate. They cannot deal with the existing individual. Socio, this is Socio's words, not Kant. If we are to exist, then we must be willing to suspend the ethical. Individually, objectively, and ethically, this is dangerous, it's unacceptable, it's absurd. Does this make any sense? And I think Socio is a big fan of Kierkegaard, and yet it seems he can only go so far. Not really. It doesn't really make sense. But Kierkegaard is not trying to make sense. He's simply trying to edify us. And I don't know if that makes sense to you. Can you be edifying without making any sense? Or is this back to Wittgenstein, where I can't put it into words, I can only show you? I'll let that stew a bit. You don't have to. Yes, go ahead.
What does he mean by edifying us? He means he's trying to change our views, basically. What do you mean specifically by edify?
I don't know. Have you heard the word edified before?
When I think of that, I was
Edifice?
trying to edit our
Oh,
ideas in a way.
yeah. Not. I don't. Maybe it has the same
change,
root.
like an idea of changing perspective,
Yeah,
but not literally edit.
Well, you find roots of edify with edifice, which is the part of a structure. To edify could be, it's used sometimes in biblical hermeneutics or biblical study.
Structuralize us?
Yeah, that doesn't make much sense though either.
Instruct or
Instruct
improve.
may be the best. What's that?
Instruct or improve morally or intellectually.
That's where he wants, that makes a bit more sense. Improve, but not morally, because he's not in the realm of morality here, at least with respect to the truths that ultimately matter to the subject. Notice, Kant is interested in the subject. Kant is interested in the individual, the autonomous individual. Kant is interested in freedom in a way that Kierkegaard is interested in freedom. There are actually some interesting parallels, which I'm going to jump to right now to wrap up with Foucault. And I had you focus, I think, just on this conception of an attitude with respect to what Enlightenment and its repercussions in the current age, contemporary age, are. There's not a whole lot I can say about Foucault except there he is, and that should sum it up. Very photogenic, very interesting French philosopher. He's written, I mentioned a few things, written on issues of health, mental health, sexuality, the most perhaps well known outside of philosophy for writing on prison system, in Discipline and Punish. Very photogenic fellow. Here's a rare picture of him with hair. There's a lot of contemporary films about him. There's a documentary of him, and there's Sartre, of course, smoking. And there's a great video, if you have the time. I think it may have actually originally been in Denmark that the debate took place. Did it say it up there? But it's French subtitles for you, so don't worry. Now they both speak. There's other stuff. You can watch the whole thing. So Noam Chomsky, who's considered, he will be more of an analytic philosopher for sure, areas specialty in linguistics. Now he's more of a public intellectual talking about political issues more so. And he's still around. He's been doing this for a long time, Chomsky has. But if you have a chance to watch that video, you're not going to be tested on it. It's just edifying in many ways, yeah.
It's also a book too.
You can get the book, I think, online too. It's
super cheap.
In any case, let's wrap up I want to have time for you to do your reviews, and I don't want to spend the whole class lecturing. But I do want to return to this discussion that opened the semester. I guess it was the first or second discussion where we talked about Simon Critchley and the gap between knowledge and wisdom, and a superficial reading of continental existentialist versus analytic philosophers. It seems the analytic is interested in knowledge predominantly, to the not detriment, but to the ignorance of wisdom, or the lack of concern with it. Critchley gave an example, you might recall, of being a philosophy professor at a dinner party. Somebody comes up to you and asks, "What do you do?" "I teach philosophy." And then they ask, "What's the meaning of life?" And then the philosopher laughs, "That's not the kind of philosophy I do." That's the analytic response. And Critchley, I think rightly so, says, well, maybe we ought to be embarrassed about that. And that's the case too with some contemporary philosophers more in the narrative side, the continental side, who may be focusing specifically on issues surrounding social interactions, oppression, racism, and so forth, and not necessarily with the larger questions of meaning and purpose. And you see the viewpoints largely summed up here with Bertrand Russell saying, when the intensity of emotional conviction subsides, a man who is in the habit of reasoning will search for logical grounds in favor of the belief which he finds in himself. Whereas, of course, we know Kierkegaard might disagree with this. He finds that viewpoint, quote, nauseating. Now, the question we want to ask is, are there ways of linking these together? Is it possible to have a middle ground between the two? I think after having just read the story of Abraham and Isaac and Kierkegaard's conception of it, the answer to the first question is pretty clear for most of us. Does Kierkegaard offer too much passion, subjectivity, individuality? At least with respect to his description of Abraham, we might be inclined to say, yeah, he does. However, we might also be inclined to argue in the positive with number 2, analytic Enlightenment thinking perhaps offers too much disinterested abstraction and objectivity. And I think there may be a middle ground, or that's a silly attempt at finding a common ground between the two. It could be that that's a false dichotomy. And I can't get into the debates about this. There's a number of philosophers who kind of intermingle these two in a way that's, I think, quite impressive. George Yancey is a contemporary philosopher who does this, who melds together analytic training and continental philosophy, existentialist philosophy. Richard Rorty is another philosopher who does this. Jürgen Habermas does this quite well. And I would say Foucault, but not really. He's more on the existentialist side. And the reading you had from Foucault, I think, was actually some of his more clear stuff. He was oftentimes very difficult to read, along with people like Derrida. But I'm going to skip that. So perhaps there's a way of looking at what, with respect to Enlightenment and its influence on, the past 200 or so years since Kant wrote it. In fact, the reading you had comes from 1984, and the original publication of Kant's answer to the question, was ist Aufklärung, was 1784. The reminder of what Kant had said, first of all, about the age in which he was living, which, if you look at a lot of the writers today, from Steven Pinker to Jason Stanley and a number of others who are writing in politics, we still are within the shadow, to use Nietzsche, the shadow of the Enlightenment thinking. The question is whether or not that's a positive, negative, neither. How do we respond to it? A reminder of Kant's words on this: Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in a lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Dare to know or have courage to use your own understanding. Now, with Kierkegaard, knowledge is less important, epistemology is less important than existence, than choices, than we see this with existentialism generally. And this reminded me of Stanley Cavell, who's a contemporary philosopher, who argues some time ago that philosophy is the education of grown-ups. And in a way, Kant seems to be talking about this. And Foucault himself points out, I don't know if we've gotten out of our age, our nonage, our childishness, our immaturity. Don't know if we're yet grown up. But surely, oh, I forgot I had that there. That's my Kant joke for the day. Yes, we Kant. But surely it seems we can escape this. Foucault wants to answer this. Unfortunately, it's, where is it? Well, let me skip to page 3. There are no page numbers on the reading you had for Foucault. Sorry about that. I'd write them in here. Here Foucault is trying to address what Kant is meaning by this conception of immaturity. I have it on page 3. He says, Kant indicates right away that the way out of our immaturity that characterizes enlightenment is a process that releases us from the status of immaturity. And by immaturity he means a certain state of our will that makes us accept someone else's authority to lead us in areas where the use of reason is called for. Kant gives 3 examples. We're in a state of immaturity when a book takes the place of our understanding, when a spiritual director takes the place of our conscience. That's straight out of existentialist philosophy, or rather, you see that in existentialism as well. And then this last one might have given you pause. When a doctor decides for us what our diet is to be, and he goes on. I think that last one there may be some contention. What's wrong with the last one? Why is that different than the first 2? Yeah?
Well, it is and isn't, because what used to be considered healthy may not be considered healthy anymore. Growing up, my mom used to say that eating a spoon of cottage cheese was seen as healthy as drinking a cup of milk nowadays, but nowadays you don't see people eating spoonfuls of cottage cheese.
Because it's disgusting.
It's
That's
disgusting
why.
and
Yeah.
not good for you.
Oh, I didn't know it's not good for you. It's just
If you eat a
disgusting.
spoonful of that every day, I don't think that would be good for you, a big old cottage cheese. But I can see how, depending on the doctor, because just because they're a doctor doesn't mean they know what they're talking
okay.
about. Or
What if they're by doctor we mean a dietitian, or what's the term, nutritionist?
well, I was about to say, just because they say they're a nutritionist doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. You can memorize the test over and over and over and be a philosophy teacher, doesn't mean you know what you're teaching.
Well,
I'm not saying that
fair,
about you.
yeah,
I'm
fair
just
point.
saying in general.
No, it's a great example. But surely the reason I referenced this example, Kierkegaard would agree with the first 2. Kant gives when we use a book in place of our understanding, or when we appeal to a spiritual director to pace our conscience. But wait a minute, because in those cases it's not so obvious necessarily that the expertise or the authority is going to be the appropriate one for you in that particular case. But when it comes to food, when it comes to objective facts about what is healthy, and you're right, it does change over time, but I don't know. I'm going to go to shouldn't I defer to my doctor? Am I being immature by deferring to my doctor? Foucault? Kant? Kierkegaard? Yes?
If it were any other doctor type situation that's not related to food specifically, if you went in and you're like, hey, I think that I dislocated my elbow, can you look at it and tell me what's wrong? That's kind of the same sense you're asking somebody else for that knowledge, because you can't be an expert in everything.
And so there are experts. There are people who have studied. There are people whose job it is to know these things, and in an objective way that we as individuals should seek out. So this is Steven Pinker's argument with respect to the Enlightenment thinking, that seems to be in contrast to this notion of truth as subjectivity, that seems to be in contrast to this concern of the over-universalizing. Yeah, real quick.
Another thing, if truth is subjective, maybe what works for you doesn't work for someone else. There are some people that are lactose intolerant, they can't drink milk, and then there are some people that kind of need it because their bones are not
Yes.
forming well, or they're just...
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
That's a fair point, and I think and there it's not just a matter of taste; it's a matter, of course, of what's going to work for that individual. And in a way, the parallel could be made, but it's not going to be a perfect one with Kierkegaard in one's conception of meaning and purpose and his conception of faith. Health, what is healthy for one, seems to be the people who study this. There's objective facts out there that others can look into and say, yeah, here's the data that shows this. In general, we can universalize. Yes, it's a generalization, but it's going to be statistical rather than absolute. So maybe Kierkegaard would be fine with that. In any case, I'm jumping ahead here. I didn't want to focus too much on that point. I wanted to focus on this point. This would be page 9. He says, maybe this ethos, he calls it. It's a kind of attitude, a perspective, a way of seeing things, which is kind of how Critchley sees philosophy. Simon Critchley, from one of the first readings we had. That we ought not look at philosophy as such as a discipline that seeks just to accumulate knowledge. It is a particular way of seeing. It's a particular attitude, or as the ancient Greeks referred to it, as an ethos. And this is the case still, even with the developments and the successes of the scientific fields, the objective sciences, and that which we find in humanizing Enlightenment. He says this ethos, this attitude, implies first a refusal of what I call the blackmail of the Enlightenment. I think that Enlightenment, as a set of political, economic, social, and institutional and cultural events on which we still depend in large part, constitutes a privileged domain for analysis. To skip on a bit further, he says, that does not mean that one has to be for or against the Enlightenment. It even means precisely that one has to refuse everything that might present itself in the form of a simplistic and authoritarian alternative. You either accept the Enlightenment and remain within the tradition of its rationalism. This is considered a positive term by some and used by others, on the contrary, as a reproach. Or else you criticize the Enlightenment and then try to escape from its principles of rationality, which may seem, once again, to be good or bad. And then he goes on attacking dialectical view that is basically seen with Hegel, who also is someone attacked by Kierkegaard, of course. Where is it? Related to this, I was reminded again of Douglas Socio. Sorry. I lost the page. From that same text I quoted a moment ago, that in response to the perhaps overly subjectivity, the overt and, if you want, well, let's put it, perhaps our biggest danger today is not too much passion, but too much resentment, too much envy, narcissism, sentimentality, masquerading as a passion, not the risky leap of faith, but the false faith of mass movement, fanatical religion, or salad bar spirituality, which I assume he's talking about. Have you heard this phrase, salad bar spirituality?
Taking what you want.
Yeah, I guess picking and choosing and moving them around, which, as long as they're not inconsistent, what does it matter, you might say. Not too much subjectivity, but too much self-centeredness and too little honest reflection. And I think then we might add to that, not too much science, that's not what the problem is, but too much scientism, which, if we recall, is basically the view that science isn't simply a mode of knowing things, but is itself constitutive of knowledge. And it takes us back to Critchley, who I like the phrase, he tries to shoehorn the two together, and I think he does a fairly decent job. He borrows from Heidegger, who's not the clearest of philosophers, with this conception of an existential science. And I might add logic as well. And there he's looking at in terms of how, to borrow from a philosopher named Husserl, our lived world, our background expectations that feed into our science shouldn't be ignored. That science is not something that's outside of a culture, that is wholly objective in a way that has no bearing on our preconceived, our expectations. As Critchley will put it, if I don't believe I brought it with me, unfortunately. Maybe I did. Yeah, this is Critchley again. From the same text that you had at the beginning of the semester, but it's the last chapter. I only gave you the first chapter of this. He says, what I have called a phenomenological pre-science, or an existential conception of science. It does not dispute or refute the work of the sciences. It shows that the theoretical attitude of the sciences finds its condition of possibility in our various worldly practices. It comes out of them. And as Jürgen Habermas puts it, it's theoretical knowledge that is rooted in practical interests. Not just a kind of objective, disinterested, causal analysis of objects bouncing off of other objects. And so to find if there is a happy medium, if that's what we want to look for, the language that Simon Critchley uses could be useful here, recognizing that purely objective, purely logical, isolated contemplation isn't going to be sufficient for what philosophy is supposed to do, but nor is a purely subjective, emotional, or intuitive feeling going to suffice for giving meaning and purpose. I think there's a possibility of seeking what we might consider empathic logicians who act in the world not just to think, but also help close the gap that Critchley referenced between knowledge and wisdom. Otherwise, to go back to this quote that we had from Marx some time ago, and I forgot when we brought it up, but your philosophy is nothing but mental masturbation. There's a whole series of statues. Forgotten who. Do I have the link there? Yeah. The artist has a number of sculptures of Diogenes doing what Diogenes did, which is unsettle our sense of complacency. And I don't see any reason why one's attitude toward philosophy, and if I wanted to focus more on this, we would connect, as I do in the intro class, an attitude, what do we call a humorous attitude, which is actually found in Kierkegaard. There's a bit of it in Foucault as well. And I think you see it, as I mentioned, through a thread through some of the existentialist philosophers from Dostoevsky to Camus and Sartre, even as they were living through the Holocaust. The attitude, the humorous attitude connected to a philosophical attitude, is one that is useful in trying to make sense of, I think, both Kant's conception of the Enlightenment, but also a way of melding together both analytic and continental philosophies. Oh, I forgot I have one more thing. That's a good enough thing to end with, I suppose. Cartoon. Squirrels. We can analyze that if we wanted to, but I'm going to stop. But do you want to analyze it?
I mean,
You don't really have to.
no.
I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah.
I think it's best to leave that.
What color are the swirls?
Well, there are only brown squirrels. So that's it. You do have, if you look on your syllabi, there is that film I was going to show today. Initially, I have a link to the film if you want to watch it, the Woody Allen film. You'll note a lot of different themes related to our discussion here, not least of which is our discussion of the moral dilemma of talking about and using examples of flawed individuals like Louis C.K., like Kant for that matter. The film is from 1989. There are actually some odd scenes in it given Woody Allen's background, if you know him. You know about his background. This was before he. Actually, I don't know all the background of his current marriage, but I think it was before he had even met this person that he's married to now, who is his stepdaughter. Is that correct? It's his adopted daughter, who he's married to now. So that right there is we've left the realm of ethics, perhaps, and we have to engage in a teleological suspension of it. In any case, you won't be tested on that film, but it is a well-made film. It deals with a lot of stuff on comedy and humor, but in particular existentialist themes from Sartre, Camus. You'll note a lot of them as you go through it, and questions of where logic and reason confront or butt up against faith. I think maybe it's the case that film or story or narrative are some of the best means of addressing those conflicts. Okay, so if there are no other comments on this cartoon, none at all. All right, so what I want to do then for the last bit of time, and it may take the whole time, it may not, if you have your written assignments, which is just a review, you don't have to submit anything. If you submitted something already, that's all right, don't worry about it. Did I got everyone on the roll today, actually? I did not. I don't think. Let me just make sure I get that first. That's important. Did I see Lucian come in? And I think that's it. Did anyone else come in that I missed? Did Ella come in? Robert? No? Okay. So, your assignment is simply to, and if you have it in your phone, that's fine too. Just give your phone to the other person. Break into grapes. Get yourselves in grapes and roll about. Groups of two. Maybe somebody you haven't met with before who doesn't know anything about your paper. Or just go with whoever's right next to you. It doesn't matter, as long as you're getting something out of this. So it's a collaborative effort to improve your arguments. Ideally, the hardest thing to do is to come up with a counter-argument to your own position. So this is a good opportunity to do that. Fresh eyes looking at your paper and see where there may be problems. So first thing, I give you some overview. What are some strengths of the other person's position? And if you just have a very short paragraph, you might need to go into and expand on it a little bit. Doing that will be beneficial to you as well. Talking it through, trying to figure out what exactly it is that you think with another person is quite helpful. So do that before. Say what you agree with the other person's paper first. Then the second point, figure out what premise or premises or ideas that are false or need more support and why, and offer a counter to them. And maybe write that counter argument on their paper or type it on their text if you're able to do that, so that they can take it with them and use that to make any amendments. You have until, for you all, it's midnight on Friday. So you can turn it in early if you want. But definitely get it in by midnight. Get it in on time so that you have time to study. So I think everyone can get into groups of two. If there needs to be a group of three, that'll be fine. So where's the group here? There.
What was your name?
Okay.
Sorry.
So meeting groups of three. There we go. Please return these when you're done. Well, there's 1, 2, 3. So please don't mark these, just return them when you are done.